Hello, guys. Hi, everyone, for tuning in. I'd like to especially welcome you to this edition of Hello Africa series, um, a program put together by Youth Alive Foundation to help us get through um, the needed information we will need to have during this pandemic. Today, as we would have broadcasted and as you have seen, we will be talking about the effects of COVID-19 pandemic on persons with disabilities in Nigeria. Um, I'll be talking to two guests today who will be joining me very, very shortly. Irene and Lois, both who are women who have gone very far in the field of disability, who have worked and experienced issues around disability, and they'll be sharing their views with us today. Please feel free, guys, to drop your questions, start up a watch party, share the videos, and get as much people as you can to come get on the video. Because this series or this session has to do with COVID-19 and persons with disabilities. To ensure inclusion, of course, I have Yemisi Layade, as you can see on your screen, helping us with the sign interpretation for persons with disabilities who will be joining us. So yes, today promises to be very, very exciting. It promises to be very, very informative. It promises to be very educative. So I know we have a lot of questions. We have a lot of thoughts. We have a lot of concerns regarding COVID-19. But yes, it's been happening. It's been a pandemic now for a while. Economies have crashed. Health sectors, health system across the world is in very, very, very huge situations. Of course, with us in Nigeria, it's not any different. Think of the fact that we've continued to go through life since COVID-19 has come in. With the lockdown and with all the issues we've faced, before COVID-19, persons with disabilities have continued to suffer huge stigma, marginalization across every sector you can think of in Nigeria. This is a global concern, but it's even peculiar for our context in Nigeria, where, if someone has a disability, it is almost as if there is a stereotype attached to disability in Nigeria, where if you've got a disability, you are almost in quotes, almost as if you are commissioned to go into arms begging on the street. And that's why, of course, it's said that disability is a cause and consequence of poverty. Persons with disabilities do not have access to healthcare, do not have access to opportunities such as employment, education, and they continue to suffer across every sector of the Nigerians of Nigeria. With the coming of the pandemic, the global pandemic, this case has worsened. We have continued to see that the government have made a case of distributing palliatives and disbursing cash transfers to the most vulnerable or the poorest of the poor within the country. However, in an engagement I had with the group that put up, that managed the nationals, the registry that contains the list of the poorest of the poor, as it is said in Nigeria. And it was interesting in my questioning, do we even have persons with disabilities on the National Social Register, which is a document that is used to, distribute the palliatives from the government. The statistics put persons with disabilities in Nigeria between 20 to 28 million people to say they've got a disability within Nigeria. And it was interesting in my questioning the prioritization of persons with disabilities in the National Social Register. What I found out was that there is just about 300, a little below 400,000 persons with disabilities captured in the National Social Register. So yes, there's been a lot of talk in the country as regards, what is the indices used to say this person is the poorest of the poor. And we have that captured in the register as to what processes were used to put in people or delineate people into various groups and then categorize them as being a poor. And of course, that makes them eligible for the government palliatives. But it's still very shocking if we've got over 20 million people who are said to be living with disabilities in Nigeria. And we just have 300,000 persons captured. It is no longer, it's captured in research, it's captured anecdotally, it's captured on the streets, it's captured in the news. We see this every day. So it's not something we just wake up to say persons with disabilities are being deprived in every sector of the economy that you can think of. So even in the States where we are with all the lockdown, persons with disability, imagine someone who's got a disability, that person cannot even access, In the first place, this person in court has been commissioned to be on the street to beg, depending on the context, because there are no opportunities to food, no opportunities to job, no opportunities to education. And this person now is on lockdown. This is even hard for persons who are supposedly abled, not to talk about persons who've got disability. So it's going to be a very interesting session today. I'll be talking with people. This is just to set the background before I bring on my guest. This is just to set the stage for us, just to have an understanding. Of course, we already have this understanding, just that these issues are not just spoken about, even from the words used to refer to persons with disabilities in the first place is discriminatory. I was just having a chat with some people over Twitter shortly before I came online, and it was people referring to persons with disabilities as crippled, as handicapped, and all sorts of discriminatory words. So even the terms used to as in terms of naming persons with disabilities or labeling persons with disabilities as it is, it's discriminatory in itself. So today we will be having those conversations with experts who have, worked in the space of disability, who have experienced disabilities themselves. So I'll be bringing on very shortly. I'll be bringing on my first guest today, who I'll be speaking with, is the Chief Executive Officer, or the Executive Director, if you like. I like to just say the boss of Cedar Seed Foundation, Lois Auta. Lois Auta has over 5 years experience in advocating for the rights of persons with disabilities. Interestingly, Lois is the first Black female with disability in Africa who has been named a Young Global Leader at the World Economic Forum. Lois was also part of the candidates who contested for the House of Representatives in Amak Buhari Federal Constituency in the 2019 elections. She's achieved so much in her life space. She's worked in the space of disability. She's experienced disability, and she'll be joining us today with this chat to have a chat around these discussions. Thank you very much, Lois, for joining us. You're welcome. Okay. I think Lois, can you hear me? All right. Before we get Lois fully on, we will just keep going until she's fully on with us, and then we can continue. We can begin to engage her with the discussions we've had. We have laid out today. Lois, can you hear me now? Right. Okay. Anytime Lois kicks in, we will get back to her, but we will keep setting the ground. We'll keep. I think Lois is having a bit of an issue with internet connection, but we will keep the conversations going. And whenever Lois comes in, I'll also be talking to Irene, who will be coming online as well. So whenever they join us, we will continue with that conversation. Now, I'd like to set the stage just before they come in. To give you a bit of background of what happens globally, and then, of course, trickling it down to Nigeria. So we've got a document. We've got the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. This convention, came into this. This was a convention we ratified. This was a document we ratified in 2007 and 2010, respectively, in terms of the convention and its optional protocol. Simply, this is just what tends to protect the rights of persons with disabilities globally. Countries, over 160 persons, 160 countries have ratified the conventions on the rights of persons with disabilities. Interestingly, like I said, Nigeria ratified that in 2007 and 2010. Now, the implication of Nigeria ratifying that is that we went to the United Nations, we ratified this. The commitment we made by ratifying the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in 2007 and 2010 was that we made a commitment to say, we are going to ensure that persons with disabilities in our country, Nigeria, are well taken care of. We're going to ensure that the rights of persons with disabilities is upheld. We're going to ensure that they've got adequate opportunities to thrive, to have better, or to have a quality life, just like every other person who is supposedly abled. But we came back home after we ratified that in 2010. And then countless advocacies continue to happen with NGOs, organizations. And the only time we ratified that, we signed our own, the Discrimination Against Persons with Disabilities Prohibition Act 2018, otherwise called the Nigerian Disability Law. The only time we signed that into law, our own disability law, was in 2019, January 2019, exactly 9 years after we ratified that at the UN. So it was very interesting for us to go to the UN and say, oh yes, we're going to take care of persons with disabilities. We're going to ensure that, their rights are upheld. We're going to ensure that they've got all the opportunities to thrive. But then we came back home, and it took us 9 years to sign our own disability law. I'm trying to bring in Lois. I can see she's, we're trying to connect back to her, but I'm trying to set the stage because we're going to be asking Lois and Irene these questions shortly, and some of the questions that we've got here. And we're going to also be taking questions from viewers. I can see we have a few viewers. People are watching. All of our people are dropping their comments. Yeah, we leave no one behind, and all the questions. So we'll be taking some of those questions. We'll be taking some of your comments as well as we go on. So yes, like I was saying, we ratified that law in 2010. We came back home, and it took us 9 years before we signed the disability law. Now it is at this point that we want to begin to implement the law. So think of your hospitals, guys, everyone viewing. Think of the hospitals. Think of the public buildings which you have visited, the offices. Think of the banks. Think of the places of worship, your churches, your mosque, and wherever you worship. Think of the public transport system, the buses you go on, the cars you go on. is this even all these places, are they accessible for persons with disabilities? This is a critical problem for us in Nigeria. I'm doing a research in HIV, looking at adherence of persons with looking at persons with disabilities who have HIV and how they, how efficient it is, how the system supports them to take antiretroviral drugs and their treatment. I'm thinking in the line of that in the moment where the country was on lockdown. I imagine how persons with disabilities are able to access hospitals, how they are able to access public transport system, or how they are able to get themselves to the hospital. In the first place, these people do not even have the support. Sorry to say, these people, persons with disabilities, do not even have the needed opportunities. Most of them don't have jobs. Remember, most persons with disabilities, like I said from the beginning, are sort of constrained to say, oh yeah, you've got a disability, the only thing you can do is to go on the street and beg. And we see persons with disabilities everywhere. So it's persons with disabilities have sort of internalized the process, have internalized the stigma as well, that if a person has a disability, they decide to say, oh yeah, we've got EMEC back as well. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for having me back, Aaron.
Okay, yes.
I think the network is pretty bad here right now.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, so I think we will just continue engaging on the topic that's at hand while Luis and the other person is trying to come up on board.
Yeah. We'll just try to keep engaging. I can see some people are dropping comments. So as I speak around the issues, I'll also be taking comments and also seeing what people are. So please feel free to drop your comments. Feel free to drop what you think on the comment section. I'll be taking that. Yeah, I can see Faith. Faith Gimba, people with disabilities are just differently enabled. Yes, I like that argument, and that's what I do. I say all the time. They have rights and needs that should be considered. Policies must reflect this too. Yes, interestingly, Faith, I was just talking about the policy. We didn't have this policy in place. We didn't have this law in place until now, until just January 2019. So it is just at this point that a country is beginning to think of how are we going to begin to restructure the society to accommodate persons with disabilities. We've not been doing that for a very, very long time. We've not been doing that since we ratified the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We are only just beginning to do that, And I hear a lot of talk of, calling persons with disabilities as handicapped, calling them crippled, disabled persons, and so a lot of names that we use in labeling persons with disabilities. And I'd like to say that it's sometimes you don't even want to use some of those words, but because it's already ingrained in the system, you unconsciously sometimes even discriminate persons with disabilities. Now, this is what happens in a system that from the very beginning was not conscious of the fact that persons with disabilities were there in the community. Now, like I was saying, think of the hospitals, think of the offices, think of the banks you visit, think of your places of worship. Everywhere you go to within the country, is that place accessible for persons with disabilities? If you go to the hospitals, sadly, even health professionals, in some in facilities, health facilities have been, there are stories to say, oh, persons, and this is not just a story, of course, there's also research to back that up, to say, to show that persons with disabilities are also discriminated by health professionals. So yeah,
okay, Aaron, would you like me to come in here? So while we're expecting them, okay, I've actually been into sign language interpretation for the past 9 years plus now, and I have seen a lot of things. I've seen how they have been discriminated. In fact, apart from most of the schools, that we have. I'm not talking about the private schools right
Yeah.
now. We have just very few private schools that accept, for instance, the deaf.
Yeah.
And while I was back in university, I decided to do my project. My project was based on the persons with disability and the acquisition, language acquisition, and all. And I discovered that going to check them in schools, it was a problem because you would have to travel like to the extreme end
Yeah.
of the state just to be able to reach out to them. So I think it is really a problem in this country, truly, like you have said,
Yeah.
which
Thank
I
you.
think we have.
Yes. Thank you, Yemisi, for jumping in. Hi, Lois. Can you hear us now? Lois, I think your mic. Okay. Can you
Hello,
hear us now?
Mike. Hello, Aaron.
Yes. Hi, Lois. Yes. So before you came on, I had already introduced you. We appreciate you for coming online. We know you're having challenges with the internet, but that's fine. We're glad you're here now. So that's very good. So we're just going to jump on the very first question. I was just setting a background as to what we wanted to talk about. So obviously, because you've worked in this space for a very long time, Lois, you know that it took the country very long before we signed the disability law. There was a lot
Yeah,
of advocacy. I know you were also championing causes in that regard. But it
yeah.
took the country 9 years after we ratified the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And my question is, why did you think it took us so long to do that?
Yeah. It was due to lack of interest and unwillingness to do the right thing. In Nigeria, persons with disabilities are treated as second class citizens. Their rights are not given to them. It's so sad that Nigeria is still operating on the charity model instead of human rights model, where the rights of persons with disabilities are given to them. The right to education, the right to healthcare facilities, the right to employment
I think we're still having a bit of a
The
challenge.
network.
Yeah, we're having a bit of a challenge with.
opportunities, the
Okay.
right to transport, because uh, hello,
Yes, please go on.
sorry, did you? Yeah, I'm sorry. I beg your pardon.
No,
The
please go
network
on.
interrupted.
We understand. Please go on.
Yeah, yeah. So Nigerian government is not interested in the issues of persons with disabilities, and that is why they are still operating on the charity model instead of human rights model. So why it took us so long in passing disability bill to law is because they are not willing to do so. They are not ready and they are not interested.
Very interesting. I like the fact that you said that the country was not ready. So, what you flagged as a reason why we took too long before we signed the disability law was because the country was not ready. Interestingly, you brought up the issue of the charity model. Like I said, I wrote a piece, an article some time back, and I think like what I mentioned about some of the articles, some of the models was that people have stuck to the biomedical model, which labels persons with disabilities as broken, who need therapy, who need treatment, and I basically personally subscribe to a very large extent to the social model of disability, which recognizes that the problem is with the society and not the person with disability. So I like the fact that you've brought in the issue of the charity model. charity model, where persons with disabilities are looked up as, they always need help. They're in trouble. We need to save them. So we need to give
Yeah.
them money all the time, rather forgetting the fact that these guys have human rights to protect. Very interesting. Thank you so much on touching on that. Now, just moving on. My next question to you is that how far do you think the implementation has gone? So so we signed the law in 2019. What's the country doing at the moment? What is happening on the ground regarding the implementation of the disability law in Nigeria?
Yes, the implementation is taking so long because the bill was turned to a law in January 2019. By
Yeah.
now, we should have a committee set up on the implementation plans. And after a committee is set up, what about the budget?
Hmm.
In 2020 budget, disability issues were not captured. We were not. And this is very, very important in implementing the disability law
Hmm.
because we need a National Disability Commission to be able to manage the affairs of persons with disabilities. And that cannot happen without a budget.
Absolutely.
So Nigerian government needs to act fast and start implementing the law they have signed.
Okay.
Because poverty is everywhere. Persons with disabilities are the poorest of the poor. Before COVID-19, there was discrimination, exclusion, and underrepresentation of persons with disabilities in all sectors of life. Then now that we are having a big challenge with this pandemic, the discrimination has doubled, the exclusion has doubled, and all other negative attitude that
Okay.
we
I'll
are
just
being
jump in there.
treated.
I'll just jump in there, Lois, because you've touched on a point which interests me a lot. Because you've mentioned, you've got on to my next question, which has to do with COVID-19. I was trying to set a stage for the discussion. So
Okay.
what I've gathered right now is to understand that not so much is being done regarding the implementation of the disability law. Even in funding, there's very little to show for that. In terms of representation, nothing to show for that. And this has, like you rightly said, this has doubled with the global pandemic of COVID-19. Before you came online, I was setting the stage of the Nigerian government through the Federal Ministry of Humanitarian Affairs. They're currently disbursing palliatives to the poorest of the poor, as it is said. The document used to do this is the National Social Register. From my research, I've seen that just about 300,000 persons with disabilities, little below 400,000 persons with disabilities are captured in the National Social Register. Meanwhile, we have over 20 million persons with disabilities living in Nigeria. So what do you think about the fact that we have over 20 million persons living with disabilities, but the National Social Register has just 300,000, a little above 300,000? How do we justify the fact that this palliative is reaching persons who actually need it, who are persons with disabilities? Are persons with disabilities prioritized during this time of palliatives, during this time of pandemic in Nigeria?
Not really. During this pandemic, the presidential
Excuse me. I think we're sort of losing Lois there as well. I'm just gonna, before Lois comes back, I can see, excuse me, be sure that this is not COVID-19, guys. Yeah, just this. Yeah. All right, so before we get Lois back, I'm just gonna read a couple of questions. I can see we have a few people online. So I'm just gonna, just before I get Lois back, I can see that somebody has said, Joshua, as he has said that he said that the introduction of the sign language on the program is a good development. It shows you're walking the talk. I'm really enjoying it. Kudos to you. Thank you very much. We really appreciate Youth Alive Foundation for putting this together. Thank you for coming on and dropping that very interesting comment. Yes, I like this other one by Atta Hadiza. I think she's someone I follow. I follow organization as well on Twitter. As she said, one major issue I think we should address is the ignorance of persons with disabilities to their rights as citizens of a country, especially those in the rural areas. I am Hadiza Atta, founder, People with Special Needs Africa Foundation, and this is one findings during advocacy. Yes, Atta Hadiza, yes, I follow you. I follow PSN on Twitter. I see the work you do, particularly in Nasarawa State and across the country. What you've said is rightly very correct. It's good that you're doing a lot of research to justify the work you do as well. And from what you've seen on ground, yes, ignorance is a big thing. That's why we have stigma. People do not understand this. Like we were just talking with Lois, Nigerians or people around the world subscribe to the charity model of disability. And they think that persons with disabilities are helpless, they have no abilities, they are broken. If we don't help them, they are going to die. Meanwhile, these are persons who are, as I would like to say, just differently able, who have massive abilities, massive capabilities. And we've seen them, across the world doing a lot of things. So yes, ignorance is one thing we should tackle. I really, really agree with you on that, Hadiza. Thank you so much for the work you do at PSN. I'm just going to be taking on a few comments. Yes, I've seen one from my very good friend and my former boss, Peace Eno. Implementation is always a major factor. There have to be increased advocacy for this to happen. If not, it's going to be business as usual. I totally agree with you, Peace. Advocacy was what happened since we ratified the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. NGOs like YAF, NGOs like DRAG, NGOs, organizations continue to go on advocacy for this, but very little has happened. As we've heard from Lois, even in the implementation of the disability law, the Nigerian disability law, very, very little is being done regarding that. So yeah, thank you very much, Pace, for noting that as well. I'm just going to be picking on the comments randomly and dropping on for people to hear what people's thoughts are before we we go on with the discussions, and maybe we have Lois back. Yes, Joy Gabby, she said, charity model. I bet this model portrays a helpless situation for persons with disabilities. Absolutely, Joy. Yeah, if you think someone is helpless, if we think someone is broken, if we think someone, if we don't help that person is going to die, then all we're simply doing is disempowering persons with disabilities, who, as I would like to say, are just differently abled. Thank you very much, Joy, for dropping your thoughts on that. I'm just going to check again and see what other comments we've got. Fegimba has said, social norms in this part of the world influence the stereotype against persons with disabilities. Absolutely, Faith. Social norms. This, if you go into research, if you look at the news, there's so much talk about social norms. There's so much talk about how persons with disabilities have been discriminated against. Some of this discrimination is rooted in the cultural, some is rooted in our culture, is rooted in our beliefs, and this drives that a lot. There are reports, widespread reports across the country, across some parts of Africa, where persons with disabilities are used for ritual purposes because it's believed that they're gonna using a person with disability for ritual is gonna elongate life, or is gonna bring wealth for the person. So there are lots of cultural beliefs that are associated in our norms that have exacerbated the case for persons with disabilities. So yes, thank you very much, Faith. I'm just gonna look up for other comments. So please feel free to drop your questions, drop your comments if you've got any questions. So Calvin has said true, but what's the way forward? We're gonna get to that, Calvin. We'll get towards that truth as we continue the discussion and we go on. Just before we have we get Lois back and some of our guests. Yes, so we're talking about just before Lois went off. She tried to let us know why it has been a slow process for Nigeria to sign its own disability law. When we went further to dig on issues of implementation, rightly, she has mentioned that implementation is very, very, very slow. Some people will expect or will argue that yes, because we just signed the disability law in 2019, for it to be this slow is can be justified, but which is what I refuse to subscribe to. Like we were talking about regarding why we think the disability law took so long, and what is happening in terms of implementation on the ground, and what is happening in terms of the disbursement of the palliatives to cushion the effects of the pandemic for us in the country. There's a lot of talk that the government is using the National Social Register to distribute the funds to the poorest of the poor, like we were just trying to establish with Lois before we lost our connection there. What I was pushing on with trying to get the response from Lois was that we have over research puts persons with disabilities in Nigeria to be between 20 to 28 million. But on the National Social Register, which is supposed to be a document that is used to distribute, that sort of categorizes the poorest of the poor, as it is said in Nigeria, we just have only a little below 400,000 persons with disabilities on that list. So what I was trying to get Lois to explain to us, or kind of give her own view on, was the fact that if we have just 300, a little below 300,000 persons on the National Social Register, how then do we justify the fact that this palliative is really going to get to the poorest of the poor, persons with disabilities, who are, of course, without argument, among those who are extremely poor, because they do not have access to opportunities that the supposedly abled have within the community. So it's very interesting to see, and that's why I've continued to personally engage the persons I can in the right spaces regarding, asking these critical questions about how do you ensure that this funding gets to persons with disabilities. We have seen pictures, we have seen videos on how the government disburses, the funds, and how this have been done. A lot of questions have come up from that, as regards the safety of that, but that is not within the remit of this discussion. The point is, how does the government ensure that these palliatives reach persons with disabilities? Bearing in mind, guys, that some of these persons with disabilities might not be able to even access the places where some of these funds are being disbursed. There's been conditional cash transfers which has been part of the scheme to cushion the effects of the pandemic by the government. But we have persons with disabilities who, some of them sadly do not even have wheelchairs. Some of them have not even eaten. Some of them do not even have the capacity to leave their houses. Some of them live alone. Some of them don't even have houses. Some of them do not have access to the internet. They do not have access to the information that we do to say, oh, the government is sharing or the government is disbursing funds here. How do we ensure that this gets to them? So these are some of the questions I was very interested in learning from Lois. We hope that she comes back as well. We've got other things, but we'll continue with the discussions and I'll continue to take your comments. Yes, so I've seen Mr. Hassan Sarkin Noma. Yeah, I want to use this medium to appreciate the then governor of my state for establishing a special school in the states and endorse disability law in the state. Now we are doing well in that regard. As such, education is something good to have. Yeah, that's good to hear. That the former governor of your state in Nasarawa, it's established a special school. But again, in terms of the special schools, there's a lot of talk around that. So it's good to see that you've brought that up. And if I'd like to probe that a little bit more, there's a lot of stories around special schools around the country where these schools are simply just being set up and the appropriate facilities are not even there. So it's wanting to set up these special schools, but do we have trained staff? Do we have trained teachers? Do we have the facilities to support learning? Do we have everything that is needed for the students to learn appropriately in the school? That's another angle to look at it. Like the problem with the country is right from the top. If it took us too long to sign the disability law, that's always been. So what then happened? So yeah, but it's good to hear that perspective from you. I'm just going to be scrolling down to take the comments before I continue on the discussions that I've got. I'm just going to go again to take the comments from Peace, who have said some culture promote beggarly mindset and system as a means of earning an income among persons with disabilities in their communities. What efforts have been made to change this mindset? A very good question there, Peace. Like we mentioned, I think Faith brought this regarding social norms in the comments the other time. It's interesting for you to also bring that up. So yeah, it's like I said earlier, it's an issue that is also rooted in cultural belief for us in Nigeria. Everything we do revolves around our religion, revolves around our morals, revolves around our religion. And people, because people do not understand this, do not even understand that anyone can have a disability. A lot of people were not born with disabilities. So because it is rooted in our culture, that is a very, very hard thing that can only happen with more education, more awareness. 10 years back, the case that has to do with persons with disabilities is gradually trickling down, and we have more awareness now. And what seems to happen is that people tend to stigmatize and discriminate against what they do not understand. Our society does not accommodate persons with disabilities. The facilities are not there. And instead of us taking ownership to say, yes, we've got to make our society, make our community accessible and accommodating for persons with disabilities, we sink back to the culture, and begin to continue to discriminate in that line. And again, that's obviously linked to the issue of the charity model, where we only think that persons with disabilities, because they are broken, they can't walk, they can't talk, they can't hear, the only thing they can do is to go on the street to beg. Sadly, because they do not have opportunities to a good life, like the supposedly able, education is not there, facilities, uh, the facilities for education is not put in place for them, you know. So what then happens? They resort to saying, "Oh yeah, we don't, we don't have access to education, we don't have access to food, we don't have access to jobs. The only thing that they resort to is begging." In Nigeria, if they don't beg, if you think of it in that light, there are no opportunities that are there for them. The government does not care. Most of the people around do not care. The only thing they resort to do is begging, because everyone thinks you have a disability, go and beg. And that's what we see to continue to happen. So the only thing we can do in that regard, to my mind, is to keep spreading the word, keep up the advocacy. NGOs are doing a lot of good work in that regard, and so we just need to keep up the speed regarding awareness raising, and debunking the myth around persons with disabilities. They've got abilities like every other person, and that's why we must stop using discriminatory terms as nomenclature for persons with disabilities. They are not handicapped, they are not crippled. We must use the appropriate term. It starts from there. Open space. I'm just gonna look at more of the questions. Thank you so much for your contribution, guys. All right, Faith. Faith again is saying a lack of political will is the major cause of the neglect of persons with disabilities. They are being treated as second-class citizens. This is a blatant violation of their rights, and could even culminate as an abuse of human rights. Yes, absolutely, Faith. That is the case with persons with disabilities. It is a lack of political will, which started from the beginning, started from the top. Our government not recognizing the fact that we need to sign the disability law very, very quickly. Sometimes we need very, very firm laws, to state the rules very, very clearly. If you're setting up a structure, if you're setting up a building, you have to ensure that persons with disabilities are accommodated. If you're building a hospital, persons with disabilities are accommodated. If you're building a church or a mosque or a place of worship, persons with disabilities need to be accommodated. If you're building a bank, if you're building a school, whatever you're building, persons with disabilities must be accommodated. If you're setting up a transport company, you must ensure that you put in place structures to accommodate persons with disabilities. And the progress is very, very slow. We just signed the law in 2019. I'd like to think that is progress. I'd like to think that that the process has started for us, but I personally still think that we can speed up. And it has become very glaring to us that our health system is in a state where persons with disabilities could not access at all. Right now, persons who are supposedly able are even having difficulty to access good health care because of the pandemic. What then happens to persons with disabilities? So these are some of the things we will need to think on. These are some of the things. The government is doing so much. The government is doing its best. I wouldn't give credit to say it's doing so much. The organizations and NGOs are doing their best, but again, we need to step up our game, because we have neglected persons with disabilities for a very, very long time. They have continued to be marginalized across all sectors of society. COVID-19 has come and changed the tide of things for everyone, and this has become even more problematic for persons with disabilities. And until we go back to the drawing board to ensure that whatever we do, we have to always ensure that we accommodate persons with disabilities, then we'll continue to get it wrong. Like some of the points where people have mentioned, it's rooted in our culture, it's rooted in in our beliefs. And because of that, it's very, very difficult to push that out of the system. But then again, I strongly believe that with the right laws, with the right implementation of the law, where systems are set straight to say this is what has to be done, or this is what is needed to be done for persons with disabilities. If these things are put in place, it's got to come from the top. It's got to come from the government. The government needs to, speed up in what it needs to do to ensure that persons with disabilities are accommodated. So I'm just going to go back to some of the questions which I wanted to initially ask Lois, but because she's not here, we're just going to talk around those questions as well. So we've spoken about the fact that is the country prioritizing persons with disabilities in the disbursement or distribution of palliatives. I've mentioned that persons with disabilities are underrepresented in the National Social Register, which is the document used for the disbursement of that palliative. And if they're underrepresented, how do you ensure that persons with disabilities are getting the palliatives from the government? 20 million persons are living. 20 million persons with disabilities within the country, but just over 300,000 people, 300,000 are represented in the National Social Register. How do we justify the fact that the palliatives from the government is reaching them? The supposedly abled, so dubbed within Nigeria, the reports that not everyone is captured. Well, it's what it is. It's not everyone will be captured as it is in the system, or as it is in the Nigerian context, where we have a lot of people who are poor, but people are underrepresented in the National Social Register. Persons with disabilities who have been marginalized for a very long time are underrepresented in that register. How do we ensure, or how do we justify the fact that the government palliative is reaching persons with disabilities? So I think we'll need to keep engaging the system. We need to engage the communities. We need to engage the government to understand that persons with disabilities need priority. In fact, I would expect that in this time, persons with disabilities are put first on the priority list before every other person or before every other thing is spoken of. But again, we don't even have the adequate data for persons with disabilities in the country. So that again becomes very, very difficult in capturing what is happening regarding persons with disabilities in Nigeria. Going back to, I'm just going to run through to see if you've got some questions as well. Yeah, so I've seen Al-Mubarak, Ikute. We also know as a challenge that CSOs should, as a matter of urgency, learn how to mainstream inclusion of persons with disabilities and vulnerable persons in their plans and decisions. What will be your advice in that regard? I will lean very, very closely with you on that, Ikute, regarding civil society organizations mainstreaming inclusion in their projects, in their programs. Sadly, this has not been happening for a very long time. Development partners have neglected persons with disabilities. If you think of every age group, so CSOs are doing projects regarding children, regarding women, regarding, for instance, sex workers, regarding young people, regarding adolescents, regarding different cadre of persons within the community. But if you think of women, if you think of adolescents, if you think of children, if you think of men, if you think of every age group you can think of, you will also find persons with disabilities within those age groups. So persons with disabilities cut across every sector of the society, they cut across every age bracket. So why have we been neglecting them? Sadly, yeah, this is what has been happening. There has been neglect, but people are picking up. I've seen CSOs in this time doing a lot of work to support persons with disabilities, or to push the fight for persons with disabilities. I think the only thing I would say in that regard is that CSOs will just need to learn from the interesting things, interesting conversations or interesting programs other NGOs are doing already in that regard, and then continue to mainstream this. Like you said, that's the only way this is going to happen. If we do not talk about these issues, we will not get it right. So I'm going to bring someone on board. I can see Samson and Duma, who is here. I know we're almost rounding up. But yeah, Samson, welcome. We're just having a chat. I'm sure you've been following regarding all has been happening. I also like to very quickly hear your thoughts about what's been happening with persons with disabilities in the era of COVID-19 regarding what the government has been doing. They're underrepresented. What are your thoughts? Right. I think our system has been very, very dodgy today. When we get Samson back, we will talk to him again. I'm going to take this comment from Tolulope. Wow, this is beautiful. Seems like the first live video I've seen since this lockdown, making use of a sign language interpreter. It's really nice. It's good we know that persons with disabilities are part of us and they deserve to be recognized and included. The TURB is doing a very good job. I joined, so let me listen. Thank you very much. We're glad we're getting some of this feedback. I've got Samson back. Samson, can you hear me now?
Very well. Thank you, Aaron. Very well. And yes, audience, good evening, everyone from Nigeria.
Yes, I was just wanted to hear your thoughts on regarding persons with disabilities. We've established the fact that persons with disabilities are massively marginalized across all sectors of the society. The government is the government is disbursing palliatives. At the moment, persons with disabilities are underrepresented in the National Social Register. How do we ensure, how do we justify that these palliatives are getting to persons with disabilities? What are your thoughts generally regarding what's happening in the Nigerian context for persons with disabilities? Yeah, I'd like to think that COVID-19 is jumping on our live stream today, but we're still going to get the talk of persons with disabilities out there because COVID-19 is in the way for everyone. It's in the way for persons with disabilities. It's in the way of our live videos today, but we're still going to get the talk out there for the necessary people to hear. Everyone's got to hear. We've got to keep singing this hymn that persons with disabilities are underrepresented. Persons with disabilities have been marginalized for a very, very long time. This is starting from the top. We took too long to sign the disability law within Nigeria, and that has trickled down. We're taking too long to implement the disability law. Now COVID-19 has shot us right in the chest, and we have seen that persons with disabilities are even in more need of, I wouldn't want to say the support because if we provide the necessary opportunities for persons with disabilities, if we ensure that they are included in, they are accommodated in our education sector, accommodated in our schools, accommodated through our hospitals, they will get the jobs, they will work, they will not be stereotyped to be begging on the streets. And then at this point, when we get we get another issue or something comes up, we will not be tilting towards the charity model to think that persons with disabilities, they need our help, they are beggars, they are in trouble, but they will be independent. We'll have massive opportunities. We've got loads of examples of people around the world who are doing exceptionally well, but they've got disabilities as well. Interestingly, Lois was with us, has a physical disability, but I read her profile and what she has achieved. Many people who are supposedly called abled or without a disability might not even be able to have achieved all those. So yes, until we get that right, the country needs to get that right. We need to prioritize that from the top. There needs to be very firm laws from the government, very firm decisions from the government. Implementation has to kick up and go very, very fast and swift, or else we will keep going around and round. I made a call on different platforms for the prioritization of persons with disabilities in the disbursement of the government palliatives. It was just yesterday I also found out that they are very underrepresented in the National Social Register. If we do not get this right, then the discrimination, the marginalizations of persons with disabilities will continue to go on, and we will continue to get it wrong. So yes, I think we are right at the time, just scrolling to see if we've got some questions coming in from the house. Faith Gimba, you said disability inclusion is key to sustainable development. I agree. Thank you very much, Faith, for your very active contributions today. Yes, Calvin Udwak, I think I've answered some of your questions. Thank you very, very much. I hope that the things, the little things we've shared today on the live video has shed light on what's happening with persons with disabilities. Sadly, we'd like to apologize that some of our guests had issues with the internet, and it kept breaking. But I hope that some of the conversations we've had today have done justice to this conversation. And thank you so much, guys, for at least for all your active participation during this. Adiz, I'm just going to take that last before we wrap up. For the implementation process, if we're not careful, we'll have to wait for another 9 years for that to happen. If PWDs don't rise up to the request for their rights. I'm sure persons with disabilities organizations are rising up to the occasion now. And we'll continue to advocate for this in every space. This is one of the platforms we've done a live video. I'm sure some persons will watch, some persons will see, and they will see the call. So in whatever space you are, please keep up doing the work, keep advocating for persons with disabilities, especially at this time of COVID-19. NGOs organizations are doing a lot. We need to call more on the government. We need to call more on individuals to prioritize persons with disabilities in everything that has been done. I'd like to thank Youth Alive Foundation for providing this platform for us to have a chat regarding persons with disabilities at this time of the global pandemic. I'd like to thank Yemisi, who has been brilliantly interpreting the signs for us today. And if we've got persons with disabilities who are watching from wherever they are, I'm sure they followed because of Yemisi's brilliant work. Thank you very much, guys. It's been an honor to have hosted this conversation with you guys. We will continue to have this conversation in our own spaces and continue to do all that we need to do. It's been a pleasure hosting you. I've had fun having this conversation. Thank you, and then see you next time. Bye, guys.